The road between Kingston and Pittston never rushed. It was the kind of route where time felt thick, like syrup poured over old photographs. The coal dust still lingered on some porches, even though the mines were dying and the men who once built their lives around them had begun disappearing too, into retirement, into sickness, into silence. But one man remained, always just out of reach. Russell Bufalino didn't need to speak loudly. He never had to bang fists or raise voices. His power didn't come from chaos. It came from stillness, from the way his eyes would rest on you and make your words stop mid-air. The quietest man in the room, and yet somehow the heaviest. He kept a tailor's storefront for years, white shirts, pressed suits, careful chalk marks on shoulders. Most who passed by just saw another immigrant family's shop trying to make an honest living in a town that forgot what fortune ever looked like. But if you knew how to listen, not just hear, you'd catch the footsteps. Men walking in, men walking out. Never in groups, always one at a time. Union men, businessmen, men with rougher hands and softer voices. It wasn't what Russell said. It was what people said when they walked away from him. Things like, "Don't cross him," or "He doesn't need to ask twice." And once, from a man with a black eye and a tremble in his hand, "You won't see it coming, but you'll know it came from him." He'd arrived in America young, like most of them, from Sicily, the island where blood and silence ran side by side. His family, like many, found their way into the rough spine of Pennsylvania, where the mines needed backs and the unions needed whispers. But Russell wasn't built to sweat underground forever. He had the eyes of a reader, the patience of a chess player, and the heart of a wolf dressed like a shepherd. Some say his rise began with favors, small ones. A dispute over wages here, a local merchant needing protection there. But what made Russell different was how he remembered. He stored names like a priest remembered sins, every debt, every favor, every insult, filed away, never forgotten, never forgiven unless he chose to. By the 1950s, the Commission, the governing body of America's Cosa Nostra, was an invisible parliament made of stone-faced kings. New York families ruled the headlines, but it was the quieter men, the ones who didn't make the papers, who made the real decisions. And Russell? He was one of them. Not just a player, a whisperer, a man whose opinion mattered not because he shouted it, but because when he spoke, the room leaned in. Some said he brokered peace between families that would have torn cities apart. Others claimed he was the one who ordered certain disappearances, the kind that never made it to trial because no one left behind a witness. But Russell never confirmed anything, not with words, maybe with a glance, a slight nod, maybe. The press called him the Quiet Don, and that made him smile sometimes, not laugh, that was too loud, but smile, faint and dry, like someone who'd seen too much to find anything funny anymore. He had no need for gold rings or loud suits. You could mistake him for your uncle in line at the post office, a man who helped his wife carry groceries, who lit candles in church every Sunday without fail. But if you watched long enough, you'd notice who greeted him, who didn't speak until he did, who turned their eyes away out of respect or fear. Still, to most, he was just Mr. Bufalino. That was enough. That name, said quietly in train stations, in courtrooms, in back booths of Italian restaurants, could stall entire investigations, send men running, or hush up problems like dust brushed under a rug. Russell liked things clean, quiet, settled. The world was loud enough without his help. But power, real power, is never truly quiet. It breathes behind doors, it rides in the back seat, it signs contracts without using a pen. It chooses who rises, who falls. And for decades, while the streets changed and the faces came and went, Russell Bufalino remained, the still figure in the background of every deal that mattered. And now, as the sun set over Pennsylvania and the streetlights flickered one by one, his story, the real story, was only just beginning. The town of Pittston hadn't changed much by the late 50s, but Russell had. Or maybe more truthfully, he'd become more himself. The suits got sharper, the shoes quieter, the greetings even more respectful. He was never the kind to demand power with a raised fist. He didn't need to. His kind of power didn't arrive with sirens or spotlights. It drifted in like fog, slow, silent, and hard to escape once it settled. He'd taken to visiting the same diner every Thursday morning. It was the sort of place where the waitress always wore the same lipstick, and the eggs were always a little too greasy. The coffee? Bad. But it kept you warm. Russell didn't come for the food. He came for the stillness, and sometimes for meetings, though you wouldn't know by looking. A handshake here, a folded napkin there, and once in a while, someone would walk in with their shoulders stiff and leave, slouched like the air had been knocked out of them, without a word spoken loud enough to remember. To the locals, he was part of the wallpaper. Respectable, predictable. Just a short Italian man who wore pressed trousers and tipped well. But underneath that mild manner was an eye that missed nothing. He watched everything, the cooks, the traffic, even the way a man held his spoon. And every piece of information was kept somewhere in that head of his, sorted like rows of ledgers in a clean vault. It was around this time that whispers started circling about a certain truck union dispute in upstate New York. A group of men had refused a delivery. They'd made demands, brought in new leadership, upset the old balance. It was ugly, and worse, it was loud. The commission didn't like loud, and Russell? He was the one they called to quiet it down, but he didn't send a crew, no guns, no threats. He took a ride, alone. The trip took him across the cold edge of the Catskills, past towns that looked like they'd been built just to be forgotten. The trees were thinning. Winter clung to their branches like a secret. He drove without music, just the hum of the tires and the occasional crackle of gravel under the wheels. The meeting took place in a roadside cabin used in the summers for fishing retreats. Now it stood hollow, reeking of wood smoke and damp wool. Inside were 4 men, big, loud, brash, truckers, union reps, and one man who thought he could build his own little kingdom on stolen loyalty. Russell walked in and didn't remove his coat. He just looked at each of them for a long moment, not scowling, not even frowning, just looking. Then he asked one question. "Who told you you could sit in my chair?" The loudest one, Tony Mancuso, sneered. "Your chair? You don't even run this district." Russell took one step forward. His shoes didn't even creak. "You think geography decides power?" Tony laughed. "I think you're old. I think your time's up." That's when Russell said nothing. He just reached into his pocket, not for a gun, but for a small, folded piece of paper. He placed it on the table, unfolded it carefully. It was a list, not names, numbers. Dates, bank statements, quiet betrayals, union funds that had gone missing, pensions unpaid, a bribe taken by someone in the room, proven, documented, undeniable. Then, like a tailor folding cloth, Russell put the paper back in his pocket. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. "You're going to go back to your people and you're going to tell them it's done. Resolved. No need to vote. No need to strike. The leadership stays as it was." Tony opened his mouth, then closed it. Russell continued, "And if you say a word otherwise, the pension funds your family relies on will vanish. You'll be lucky to afford a funeral." There was no shouting. No threats made with guns or fists, just facts, just leverage. That was Russell's way. He didn't light fires. He turned off the oxygen. On the ride home, the sky was gray and the world was quiet. He didn't look triumphant, just calm. As if the war hadn't been a war at all, just another stitch in the suit he'd been sewing since he was a boy. He liked things to fit, to stay in place. Back in Pennsylvania, a man named Frankie the Carpenter Vinci was waiting in his driveway. Frankie wasn't a made man, not yet, but he was loyal and careful. He ran errands, watched houses, picked up phones no one wanted to answer. This time, Frankie had come with news. "They're asking about Hoffa again," he said, glancing up the driveway toward the old tailor shop that now mostly stayed dark. Russell nodded slowly. Jimmy Hoffa. The name lingered like steam off a cup of bitter coffee. He and Hoffa had been allies, not friends, not quite, but there was understanding there, respect. Hoffa understood power, unions, and how to move men like chess pieces. But lately, he was becoming impatient, reckless. He was trying to claw his way back into control of the Teamsters, and the commission didn't like what that might mean. Russell had warned him once. "Don't mistake their patience for permission," he'd said. Hoffa laughed back then. "I don't need permission." That was the problem. The truth was, Russell didn't want Hoffa dead. Not at first. He liked order. Hoffa could have been brought back into the fold if he'd listened, but men like Jimmy always believed they were the exception. That respect was owed, not earned daily. So now, questions were being asked, not loudly, just enough to make the walls lean in. Back at the house, Russell sat at the kitchen table. He didn't turn on the light. The room glowed only with what little sun remained, turning the curtains a soft amber. He reached for his cup. The ceramic was warm, familiar, the same way his wife, Carrie, kept the house. Clean, quiet, controlled. She entered the kitchen with slow steps, tying her robe. She'd known Russell long enough to read his silences like letters. "Something wrong?" she asked, pouring herself tea. "No," he said. Then after a pause, "Just dust in the air." Carrie nodded. She didn't ask again. That was their rhythm. No questions unless necessary, and answers only when needed. Later that night, Russell stood by the window, looking out at the dark. Across the street, a dog barked twice, then stopped. Somewhere, a train rumbled in the distance. He thought of Hoffa again, of how power makes men hungry, of how hunger blinds them, and of how, no matter how quiet your power, eventually, someone will test it. But Russell Bufalino was not the kind of man to be tested twice, and the clock was ticking for Jimmy. He didn't need a radio to know the temperature of the country. He could feel it in the way the postman walked, in the way the unions shuffled papers slower. There was something stirring, not in the streets, but behind office doors and inside smoky restaurants where men didn't eat, only talked. And lately, those conversations had begun circling back to one man, Jimmy Hoffa. In some circles, Hoffa was a god. To the working man, he was a fist thrown through the wall of corporate greed. He made truckers feel invincible. He gave them pensions, pay, protection. But power has a cost. And Jimmy, brilliant, bull-headed Jimmy, had never paid his debts properly. He took alliances like coats in winter, used them, then tossed them when spring came. Russell had watched this before, many times. Men who thought their hands built kingdoms when really they were just borrowing the tools. It was a Wednesday morning when the call came. Not on the home line. That one was for groceries and church schedules. No, this came on the other line, the one without a number listed, the one only a few knew. Russell answered with silence. That was the greeting. If you were calling him, you already knew who you were speaking to. A voice came through, measured, East Coast accent, too clean to be a street guy, probably one of the suits. They want to know if he's still a problem. He didn't say Hoffa's name. That was the rule. Never name a man before a decision. Russell breathed slowly. A pause long enough for the caller to start sweating. "He's not listening," Russell said at last. "That's the problem." The line was quiet for a moment. "And the solution?" Russell didn't answer. Instead, he glanced outside. The neighbor's kid was playing with a red ball, chasing it like he had all the time in the world. Youth always did. It believed in tomorrows. But Hoffa was out of tomorrows. Back in New York, the commission had begun whispering louder. Russell had a seat at that table, unofficially. He wasn't a New York Don, but his reach was longer than most suspected. He had eyes in the ports, ears in the warehouses, and friends in Cuba, though Castro had made that more complicated than it used to be. The bosses respected Russell not because he brought money, though he did, but because he brought quiet. When territories warred, Russell brokered peace. When men went missing, Russell made sure the newspaper stayed clean. He was the oil that kept the rust from spreading. But Hoffa was a wrench in the machine. He wanted back into the Teamsters' leadership. And worse, he was naming names, threatening lawsuits, interviews, maybe even books. Some said he was bluffing. Russell knew better. Pride was a dangerous drug, and Hoffa was overdosing. A week later, Russell drove to Detroit. He didn't take a bodyguard. He never did. That was part of his aura. He walked like no one would dare touch him, and so no one did. The restaurant was on a quiet corner. Old Italian place, red booths, fake candles, the kind of place where the menu never changed and neither did the waiters. Jimmy was already at the table wearing that damn smirk. Russell slid into the booth across from him. "You're late," Hoffa said. Russell just looked at him. Jimmy chuckled. "You always did love the dramatic pause." The waitress came by. Russell nodded for coffee. Jimmy already had his, half gone and bitter. "You heard the commission's scared of me," Jimmy said, not asking, just declaring. "No one's scared," Russell said. Jimmy leaned forward. "They should be. I've got files. I've got details. They try to keep me out. I'll take a few of them down with me." Russell stirred his coffee slowly, though he hadn't yet added sugar. "Who told you were bigger than the house?" he asked quietly. Jimmy raised an eyebrow. "You think because you built something, it belongs to you forever," Russell continued. "But the Teamsters, they're not yours. They're part of something older, something wider." Jimmy scoffed. "Without me, that union's nothing." Russell met his eyes. "And without that union, you're dead." The words hung like smoke. Jimmy looked away first. They finished their coffee in silence. Before leaving, Russell reached into his coat, pulled out a folded slip of paper, placed it on the table. "What's this?" Jimmy asked. "A name, someone you can talk to, someone who will help you walk away quiet." Jimmy didn't pick it up. "I'm not walking." Russell stood, adjusted his collar. "Then don't be surprised when no one catches you." That was the last time he saw Jimmy Hoffa alive. The weeks that followed moved like a funeral march. Quiet meetings, shuffled envelopes, unanswered questions. Russell didn't arrange the hit himself. He didn't have to, but he gave the nod. Not directly, never directly, but he said just enough to the right man. And then that man said just enough to someone else. And eventually, a car was waiting in a Detroit parking lot. The newspapers exploded when Jimmy vanished. FBI raids, subpoenas, interviews with anyone who ever sat next to him on a bench. Russell? He went to church, bought his wife a new rosary, had pasta on Sundays. But inside, something had shifted. He hadn't wanted it to go that far, but silence had to be protected. And Jimmy had been shouting for too long. Years later, in a small house upstate, Russell sat with a man named Frank Sheeran, an Irishman, a trusted man. Some say he was the trigger man. Others say he just knew who was. Russell never asked him. Instead, they talked about dogs, about Frank's leg pain, about the food in prison. They both knew the things they weren't saying. But sometimes, silence is a form of respect. "Do you ever regret it?" Frank asked suddenly. Russell looked at him. "Regrets for men who thought they had a choice." Frank nodded. The room was dim. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like whispers too old to understand. By the late 70s, the government finally came for Russell. RICO charges, union manipulation, loan sharking. But nothing stuck long. They'd never pin him for Hoffa, not directly. He was too careful, too slow, too clean. Still, the arrests came. Prison time followed, and even then he moved like a king. Inmates called him Sir, guards deferred, his suit still came pressed, he never raised his voice. The other dons, Gotti, Gigante, Persico, they made headlines. Russell? He made history. And when he finally died in 1994 in a quiet Pennsylvania hospital, the obituaries called him alleged mob boss, as if the world still hadn't decided what he really was. But those who knew, they didn't need the papers. They remembered the man who ruled in whispers, who settled disputes with glances, who didn't need an army, only time. Because Russell Bufalino never raised a hand in anger. He simply made sure nothing happened without his blessing. And sometimes, that's more terrifying than a bullet. The wind in Montedoro was always dry, always carrying dust with it, not enough to blind you, but enough to remind you that the land had no intention of making life easy. It bit into your skin, crept into your lungs, and painted every wall the same dull brown. Children learned to cough before they learned to write. And yet, people stayed. Because for them, Sicily wasn't just soil, it was blood. roots, memory. Russell Bufalino wasn't born with that name. In 1903, he came into the world as Rosario Alberto Bufalino, in a home with walls thin enough to hear your neighbors curse, pray, and make love, all in the same night. His mother, Christina, worked as a seamstress when she could find cloth. His father, Angelo, carried limestone up steep hills for pennies. Neither of them smiled much, but they loved their son fiercely, if quietly. Even as a boy, Russell didn't speak unless it was necessary. Other children yelled, fought, made up stories about guns and bandits and kings. Russell listened. He watched. He learned how men moved when they lied, how their voices cracked when they owed someone money. He learned that fear came before violence, and that power didn't have to shout. His uncle Vincenzo was different from the rest of the town. He didn't work the fields or lift stones. He wore boots that didn't have holes in them and suits that didn't smell like sheep. And every so often, he'd disappear for days, only to return with fat cigars and meat wrapped in newspaper. No one asked where he went. That was the first rule Russell learned. Don't ask. Don't repeat. Don't forget. One afternoon, Russell found himself walking behind Vincenzo on the edge of town. His uncle walked slowly, always scanning the road, even when no one else was around. "You walk like you're being hunted," Russell had said. Vincenzo stopped, glanced down at him, then laughed. "You think I walk like prey?" he said. Russell didn't smile. "No, like someone who wants to see them coming first." That was the moment Vincenzo started paying attention to the boy, not as a nephew, but as something else. Someone who might understand the language of men who lived behind curtains and spoke with their backs to the wall. By the time Russell turned 10, he had already carried messages between men whose hands never touched dirt. He knew how to nod instead of speak, how to read fear in a man's blink. He also learned that in Sicily, survival was a negotiation and words were weapons. But Sicily, for all its beauty and blood, couldn't keep them. By 1914, with war creeping across Europe, the Bufalino family boarded a ship to America. Russell had never seen the sea before. It smelled like salt and rust, and the waves were larger than any street back home. The ship was crowded, packed with crying babies, garlic-stinking bags, and whispers of hope that maybe, just maybe, life would be softer across the ocean. The crossing took weeks. Men died. Women wept. And Russell, seasick and hungry, watched it all with quiet eyes. They arrived in New York first, where immigration officers butchered names like cows. Rosario became Russell, easier for the Americans to spell. He didn't protest. Names didn't matter. Power did. They didn't stay in New York, too loud, too crowded, too full of other desperate men trying to be kings. The family moved inland, like many Sicilians, to Pittston, Pennsylvania, where coal dust stained every window and hope was bought in broken backs. His father found work in the mines. His mother took in sewing again. Russell, he did what he always had, watched, waited, learned. He was 15 when he saw his first union beating. A man named Carducci had been taking bribes from both the miners and the bosses. Word got around. One night, 2 men dragged him behind the saloon, and he left the alley with fewer teeth and no memory of how he got there. Russell stood nearby the whole time, unnoticed. He learned something valuable that night. Justice in America came faster when you didn't wait for the law. By the 1920s, the streets had changed. Bootlegging was king. Speakeasies opened behind butcher shops, and Italian names started appearing in police reports. Some feared, some admired. Russell kept to himself, never drank, never gambled. But he knew everyone who did. He found work in a tailor shop, pressing suits by day, delivering messages by night, not just for anyone. For a man named Santo Provenzano, a quiet presence in Luzerne County's darker corners. Provenzano was old school, controlled, and he liked Russell. "You remind me of me," he told him one day, while adjusting his cufflinks. "I hope that's a compliment," Russell replied. Santo grinned. "That depends on how far you want to go." Russell didn't say it, but he'd already decided. He wasn't going to die in a coal town. He wasn't going to spend his life beneath someone else's boot, praying for pension raises and fair hours. No, he'd be the one who set the hours, who signed the checks, who told others where to kneel. The ladder up wasn't fast, but it was steady. He kept quiet, did favors, fixed problems without being asked. He helped settle a dispute between two truck companies, kept a union treasurer out of jail, and once smoothed over a fight between a Cuban cigar importer and a New Jersey Don over unpaid crates. Each time, he said little. Each time, his reputation grew. By 1930, he was sitting in meetings with men twice his age. By 1940, his name was being mentioned in New York. And by 1950, he wasn't just in the room, he was helping decide who got in. But he never forgot Sicily, never forgot the dust, never forgot the silence. Every week, without fail, he lit a candle for his mother. She'd passed quietly just before the war ended. A stroke, quick and cruel. He didn't cry at the funeral, but when he touched the dirt of her grave, he whispered something in Italian. I never forget where I came from. And he didn't. Because the boy from Montedoro, the one who learned to stay quiet while men bled in alleys, had become a king whose voice barely rose above a whisper. Cuba was never just an island, not to men like Russell. To the average American in the 1950s, it was a postcard. Beaches, cigars, rum, and music that poured out of alleyways like sugar syrup. But beneath the drums and palm trees was something else, a quiet gold mine of vice wrapped in palm leaves. And where there is vice, there is money. And where there is money, there are men like Russell Bufalino. He didn't go to Havana often, just once, maybe twice. But his reach was there before his plane touched the runway. The connections were old, Italian, Jewish, Cuban, even a few Irish names thrown in. Men like Meyer Lansky, meticulous and cold-eyed, who treated numbers like they breathed. Or Lucky Luciano, the exiled king who had left New York but never left power. Then there were the Cuban generals, the Batista loyalists, and the American businessmen who played the stock market by day and bet $50,000 chips by night. Russell didn't need the chaos. He preferred the paper, the ownership. His name didn't appear on casino licenses, not even on shell companies. But he had a man who had an aunt in Miami who owned 5% of something big, and through that chain, Russell's cut came in. Every month, wrapped tight. He didn't smile when the envelopes came, just nodded. That was how he showed satisfaction. He wasn't like the others. He didn't dance at Tropicana. He didn't keep mistresses in Cuban villas. He didn't let himself be photographed with cigars between his fingers and a showgirl on each side. Russell moved different, and the men who mattered respected that. At the heart of this operation was trust, and a very specific kind of silence, the kind of silence Russell had built a lifetime around. He didn't talk about deals. He didn't brag about what was his. That's why Luciano used him. That's why Lansky never questioned his cut. Russell's the only one I trust to count the chips without taking a bite, Lansky had once said. Russell had never forgotten that. And in return, when tensions rose, as they often did with power this large, he became the voice of reason between giants. When Lucky wanted more out of Havana and Lansky refused to give ground, it was Russell who arranged a phone call, not a meeting, that turned a possible war into a compromise. When Batista's cousin tried to pull a fast one with shipping permits, Russell sent a message through a priest who owed him a favor, and the cousin backed down without a bruise. That was his method. Fix things before they broke. But even Russell couldn't control everything. He saw the signs before most did, in the voices of the street musicians, in the shifting posture of soldiers. The way newspapers printed fewer photos of Batista smiling and more columns about change. Something was brewing in the jungle, and soon it would reach the capital. The name Fidel Castro came up at first like a joke, a bearded student turned revolutionary, a nobody. But the joke didn't stay funny for long. By the mid-50s, Fidel wasn't just a whisper, he was a wave, and everyone knew what waves did to casinos. Russell called Lansky. The line was secure. You need to start pulling your roots, Russell said. Lansky was stubborn. We have the army, we have the government. You have today, Russell replied. But you're not betting on today. You're betting on forever. And Cuba ain't forever. There was a pause. You already pulled out, didn't you? Lansky asked. Russell didn't answer. That was his answer. By the time Castro marched into Havana, Russell had already cleaned his hands of every exposed investment. His money was tucked into construction projects in Miami, restaurant groups in Jersey, and union pension funds that no one dared touch without permission. The others weren't so lucky. Luciano's empire lost tens of millions. Lansky, the smartest man in the room, lost more than that. Pride, control, territory, and Russell? He lost nothing. Because Russell didn't own Cuba. He just passed through. Back in Pennsylvania, things didn't look like they changed much. The same coffee shops, the same frost on the window panes. But Russell's influence had deepened. People didn't see it, not at first. But the men who mattered, the judges, the union bosses, the state reps, they knew, and they called, for advice, for favors, for protection. The Teamsters, especially. With Hoffa getting bolder, louder, angrier, the union was fracturing. Sides were being drawn. Russell didn't choose sides. He balanced them. He hosted dinners in quiet back rooms, set up phone calls that never appeared on records, made sure men who wanted to hurt each other sat at opposite ends of the same table, and left with new understandings and new rules. But that balancing act was growing harder. The feds were watching now, with real eyes. Wiretaps, grand juries, snitches with shiny shoes and guilty consciences. Russell's calm was tested like never before. He tightened his circle. Men who once walked freely into his home were now kept at the edge of town. Letters went undelivered, calls unreturned. The commission, especially the Loud families in New York, began questioning his moves. "Why's Bufalino pulling back?" Gotti once asked. Someone replied, "Because he knows something the rest of you don't." And they were right. Russell had seen it in Cuba. Revolutions don't always wear uniforms. Sometimes they wear badges. In 1961, something strange happened. Russell attended a funeral in Buffalo, a minor figure, a cousin of a cousin in the Magadino family. Most bosses sent a card. Russell showed up. Quiet, alone, he stayed at the back, said little. But afterward, he had a private coffee with Magadino himself, an old friend. And that's when the conversation turned to something sacred. Succession. "Sooner or later, we all sit in that box," Magadino said, stirring his espresso. "The question is, who stands in our place when we do?" Russell looked out the window. Snow had begun to fall, soft, relentless. "I don't need someone to replace me," he said. "I just need someone to keep the silence." Magadino smiled. "You'll never write a book, Russell. Books are for men who think their story ends when they die." Over the next few years, Russell became more selective. He refused meetings in public places, stopped traveling without reason. But his influence never dimmed. If anything, it deepened. Because people trusted that when Russell made a call, it meant something. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't loud. He was inevitable. And every time someone asked, "Who approved this?" or "Who said that was okay?" or "Who gave the nod?" the answer, whispered like a church confession, was Russell, even when he said nothing. And so the years passed. Cuba burned, Hoffa roared, the commission bent and cracked, new faces rose, others disappeared. But Russell remained, a quiet thread through the fabric of the Mafia's most powerful decades. His secret? He never confused volume with strength, and he never mistook opportunity for ownership. That's why, long after the bodies were buried and the deals were forgotten, one truth still echoed in the quiet backrooms of America's underworld. Russell Bufalino didn't run the Mafia. He made sure it ran itself. The summer of 1975 began with a kind of stillness that felt unnatural. The air was thick, heavier than usual, like the season was holding its breath. Across the country, things were changing. There were too many questions in the air, too many names appearing in newspapers that were supposed to stay in shadows. But for Russell Bufalino, the world outside had always moved louder than the one he kept. In his corner of Pennsylvania, he still lived like a man untouched, the same home, the same routine, morning coffee, newspapers folded once and never twice, a slow walk in the evening with his wife. He greeted neighbors with a nod, answered no questions, and gave no advice unless it was asked in just the right way, by just the right people. But the world wouldn't leave him alone, because Jimmy Hoffa had started talking again. And the thing about men like Hoffa, they never knew how to lower their voice. Russell had always had a complicated respect for Jimmy. The man had guts, no doubt about that. He stood toe-to-toe with the government and didn't flinch. He knew how to move men, thousands of them, like pieces on a board. That kind of charisma didn't come cheap, and it didn't come often. But Jimmy's problem wasn't his enemies, it was his allies. He didn't know how to sit still, didn't know how to accept victory and walk away quietly. He always had to come back for more. Power was a drug, and Hoffa, once the king of the Teamsters, was desperate for another hit. He had served time, 4 years to think, reflect, change. But he came out louder, more stubborn, less careful. And when he started making calls, demanding meetings, threatening to expose the very men who had protected him, Russell saw the writing on the wall. He didn't need a prophecy to know where it led. The call came through on a Monday afternoon. Not a voice Russell liked hearing often. It belonged to Anthony Tony Pro Provenzano, a man whose face smiled like it owed you money and had no intention of paying. Russell didn't like Tony Pro, too flashy, too impulsive, a short fuse in a room full of gasoline. But Tony was a part of the machine now, and when he called, it was never about nothing. "He's trying to call us sit down," Tony said, his voice full of disgust. "With who?" Russell asked. "Me, you, everybody." Russell was silent for a long time. Tony grew impatient. "He's threatening to take it all to the feds, the loans, the cuts, even the pension deals." That got Russell's attention. The pension fund was sacred, untouchable. It was the artery that fed half the commission's operations, real estate, construction, even politics. Hoffa threatening that wasn't just noise, it was treason. "Where?" Russell finally asked. "Detroit," Tony said. "He wants it neutral." Russell nodded once. "I'll think about it." And then he hung up. That night he didn't eat much. Carrie asked if his stomach was acting up. He said yes, but it wasn't his stomach. It was the weight of a decision. You didn't just decide to take out a man like Hoffa, not easily, not quickly, not unless you had no choice. Jimmy had friends, old ones, men who owed him favors. Killing him would send cracks through the structure, maybe even shatter parts of it. But keeping him alive? That could bring the whole damn house down. He walked outside to the porch, sat in the old rocking chair he never used unless the sky was dark. The stars were out, quiet, watching. He spoke to no one, but the words were clear in his head. If he doesn't stop talking, we'll all be buried next. 3 days later, Russell made the drive to Detroit. He didn't bring bodyguards. He never did. He liked the solitude, the thinking space. Pennsylvania to Detroit wasn't far, but far enough to remind a man that decisions like these couldn't be unmade. The man in the passenger seat was Frank Sheeran, the Irishman, a known hitter, trusted, steady. Russell had used Frank before, never for anything small. Frank respected silence. That's why Russell kept him close. They spoke little on the drive, talked about food, a little about the weather. At one point, Frank mentioned something about getting a new truck. Russell nodded. Good, a man should keep moving. It was the only line that mattered. Detroit looked the same as always, a little tired, a little angry. Streets full of smoke and talk, everyone looking for someone else to blame. Hoffa was staying at a nearby hotel. Russell didn't go. He sent someone else. A final message. Sit tight. The meeting's coming. Hoffa was impatient. Of course he was. He paced the room, called his wife, ate nothing. He had no idea the car that would come for him would never bring him back. Russell didn't need to be there. He never needed to be at the scene. His power worked like gravity, always felt, never seen. The decision had been made, not in a dramatic vote, not in a smoke-filled room, but in a quiet nod over coffee. In the silence between men who understood that when a piece no longer fits, it must be removed before it poisons the board. Frank Sheeran drove the car. What happened next? He never confessed in court, only in whispers, in late-night confessions with eyes that had seen too much. Some say Hoffa was shot, some say he was strangled, some say he begged. Russell didn't ask. He never asked how the job was done. Only that it was finished. The FBI lost their minds. The media exploded. Books were written. Films were optioned. Theories stacked on top of theories. But no body was found. No tape, no witness. And Russell? He went back home, had tea with his wife, read the paper, shut the curtains at night. They came for him eventually. Of course they did. RICO charges, wire fraud, loan schemes. They couldn't get him on Hoffa, not a word, not a fingerprint, not a phone call. But they got him on enough. He served 4 years in federal prison. Then they tried again. Added more charges. Another sentence. By then he was in his late 70s. But prison didn't shake him. He didn't ask for favors, didn't beg for deals. He ate quietly, read quietly, slept like a man with no fears. Guards feared him more than the younger inmates. Because Russell never needed fists, just a look, a word, a pause, and still, even inside, men came to him for decisions. Should I make this deal? Should I trust that guy? Is this a setup? He never said much, just gave his verdict in the way only he could, and when the guards came to tell him his lawyer was on the line, he didn't move quickly. Time no longer meant the same thing. Because when you've watched the world from the shadows long enough, you learn the most important truth. Everyone talks eventually. Only the powerful know when to stay silent. And Russell? He stayed silent to the end. The prison wasn't what most imagined. It wasn't all screams and stabbing and clattering metal trays. At least, not for Russell. He wasn't placed with the maniacs. He didn't walk into a yard full of blood and noise. No, men like Russell were handled carefully, with precision, not out of mercy, but out of fear. He was processed like everyone else, fingerprints, photographs, issued a number. But when the guards handed him the uniform, they didn't look him in the eye. One of them even apologized. "Sorry, Mr. Bufalino, protocol." Russell said nothing, just nodded and took the clothes. Inside, it wasn't what it used to be. The old mafia, the real thing, had been bleeding for years. The ones that were left inside, the few who still remembered what omerta really meant, recognized Russell immediately. They gave him space, not just out of respect, but because they knew who he was. Not the name in the papers, not the ghost they tried to pin Hoffa's murder on, but the voice behind every major American underworld move for 30 years. And now, that voice was inside 4 walls. Russell didn't ask for anything. That was the first thing the guards noticed. Most guys came in demanding things: better pillows, commissary favors, phone time. Russell just observed. He learned the layout. Who worked which shifts? Which guards talked too much? Which inmates were desperate for attention? Which ones were smart enough to survive? He never made the first move, but everyone made theirs toward him. The old mob guys offered him their seats at lunch. One guy even gave up his bunk when they accidentally assigned Russell to the top. That was the thing. Russell wasn't physically intimidating. He was old, frail in the eyes of younger men. But power doesn't live in the shoulders. It lives in the space between silence and obedience. And when he sat in the yard, quiet, sipping lukewarm coffee in the sun, men joined him. Not too close, not too loud. They'd say things like, "Frankie got 6 years," or "Word is Gallo's nephew flipped." They'd say it and wait for a nod, a look, a single word. Russell would say little, if anything, but his reaction was the verdict. If he didn't respond, it meant nothing would come of it. If he gave a slow nod, it meant, "We expected this." But if he stopped drinking his coffee and simply stared, that meant, "Fix it." The prison administration knew exactly who they had in their hands. The FBI had been chasing Russell for decades. They knew he had information that could rewrite books, end careers, close dozens of open cases, names, bank accounts, old murder contracts, hidden informants, all of it in his head. And so they tried. First came the friendly ones. The federal agents who visited with folders and half smiles. "You're almost 80, Mr. Bufalino. You've got nothing left to prove." Russell stared at the table, didn't speak. Just help us understand what really happened. Help us write the real history. Still silence. You don't even have to testify. Just tell us, off the record. You've done your time. Don't you want your side told? Russell finally looked up. You think this is about ego? The agent leaned forward. Isn't it? Russell let the silence hang for a moment, then said, No one needs to remember me. And that was it. They tried again 2 months later, offered deals, lighter restrictions, more phone time. One agent even said, What if we name a wing after you, write a book, protect your legacy? Russell smiled, dry and cold. My legacy, he said, is silence. Inside, he kept to his routine. Wake early, stretch, read, walk. He reread the same worn copy of Dante's Inferno again and again. Not because he liked poetry, but because Dante understood something most people didn't, that the worst punishments are reserved not for monsters, but for traitors. Russell wasn't religious, not anymore. He believed in systems, in codes, in the sacred rules that built the life he lived, and among those rules, none was greater than loyalty. He saw the cracks everywhere now. Younger inmates, even the ones from Italian crews, were softer. They talked too much, flipped too fast. Their eyes darted around like prey, always thinking about deals, about what they could get out of it. But Russell never did this for deals. He did it because he believed in order. He didn't see himself as a criminal. He saw himself as a caretaker of balance, of loyalty, of rules that protected communities, families, economies even. He didn't glorify violence, he contained it, controlled it. When the world got loud, he made it quiet again. One day, a young guy from Brooklyn, barely 30, came to sit next to him in the yard. He was nervous. They say you were the one who gave the order, he said. Russell didn't look up. About Hoffa, the kid continued. They say you made that call, that you killed the king. Russell slowly turned to him, eyes calm. No kings, he said. Only men who forgot the rules. The kid nodded, waited, and then, like a fool, asked, So is it true? Russell didn't respond. He stood up slowly and walked away, leaving the kid sitting there, like a dog waiting for a whistle that would never come. In the final year of his sentence, Russell was moved to a medical unit, not because he asked, but because age had caught up to even him. His heart was growing tired, his joints stiffer, but his mind, still sharp as the day he walked in. The doctor spoke to him like a patient. The guard still treated him like a judge. Even the chaplain came to visit once, hoping to offer spiritual comfort. Russell let him sit, let him talk, but offered no sins, no confessions. I've made peace, he said. The priest looked hopeful. With God? No, Russell said, with what had to be done. On the night of his final breath, no one knew it was coming. The nurses said he looked peaceful, like he was dreaming. The sky outside was cloudy, hiding the stars. The halls were quiet. When they found him, his book was still open on his chest. Dante. His hand resting on a folded napkin someone had left with his dinner. He hadn't touched the food. He had died like he lived, on his terms. No final words, no drama, just a long, quiet exhale. And then, silence. When word spread that Russell Bufalino had died, the press barely reacted. A few newspapers ran small stories. Alleged mafia boss dies in federal custody. The same headline they'd written 10 times before, but in back rooms, across 3 states, in aging social clubs and old restaurants, glasses were raised, not in celebration, not in sorrow, in respect. Because Russell wasn't just a man, he was a standard. And with his passing, the last true thread of the old mafia, the one made of rules, patience, and silence, finally unraveled. And all that remained was noise. Death didn't follow ceremony when it came for Russell Bufalino. There was no grand procession, no black Cadillacs in a long, slow caravan, no 21-gun salute. Just a casket, a few old men in wrinkled suits, and a church so quiet you could hear the wind through the cracks in the stained glass. Even his tombstone was modest, nothing flashy. Just a name, a date, and a quote carved in Sicilian dialect that roughly translated to, What's done in silence holds forever. But outside that graveyard, in cities that once whispered his name with reverence and fear, something began to shift. It was subtle at first, an uneasy vibration, like a note played slightly out of tune. And then, chaos, creeping like a vine across the walls of every room Russell used to control. Because for decades, men like Russell had kept the structure intact. The Mafia had rules, codes, boundaries that couldn't be crossed without consequences, and above all, there was order. Russell wasn't flashy like Gotti, he wasn't a press darling or a street legend, but he was the glue, the quiet link between families, the last man you could trust to see the whole board, and not make the wrong move just to feel powerful. And now he was gone. And men started to talk. The first crack came from the inside, always from the inside. Philadelphia. A soldier named Carlo Benedetti, not made but close enough to the life, got pinched for moving heroin through a plumbing supply company. He was looking at 25 to life. 5 years ago, he'd have shut his mouth, done his bid, maybe gotten promoted on the back end. But now there was no Russell. No one to assure him his kids would be fed. No one to make a call to the judge's brother-in-law. No one to enforce the old promise, we take care of our own. So Carlo flipped, and what spilled out of his mouth was enough to reopen 5 cold cases, burn a trucking union to the ground, and put 2 captains into witness protection. And that was just the beginning. Russell had known this day would come. That's why he kept no journals, left no diaries, told no tales. He didn't trust memory. He trusted absence. If you weren't there, you couldn't be questioned. If you didn't speak, no one could say they heard you. But the men after him, they tweeted. They wrote memoirs. They made podcasts. They bragged about sit-downs with ghosts, and the law loved it. The FBI, once frustrated by Russell's stonewalling, now sat back and watched the next generation destroy itself. Frank Sheeran, the man whom many believed had carried out the hit on Hoffa, aged poorly after Russell's death. He had always been loyal, in the way a dog is loyal to the hand that feeds him. But now the hand was gone, and Frank was left with too many ghosts and a truth no one wanted to carry anymore. He drank more, talked more, whispered to a journalist here, a writer there. By the late 90s, he was speaking openly, not always coherently, but consistently. Yes, he said in one taped conversation, I put Jimmy down. I did what had to be done. Russell told me it was time. Was it true? No one knew for sure. Frank's memory was a jigsaw puzzle soaked in whiskey and guilt, but it didn't matter. The illusion of silence was broken, and when Russell's name came up again, in courtrooms, in books, in Hollywood films, he couldn't defend himself. The dead don't testify. Meanwhile, the commission, once the sacred circle of organized power in America, started to fade like smoke. By the early 2000s, its meetings were infrequent. Half of the bosses were either in prison or under surveillance. The other half didn't trust each other. The younger guys didn't respect the rules anymore. They shot first, posted photos later. They weren't made from the same cloth. They were made from screens. Raised in the age of ego, not omerta. One capo in Brooklyn started a YouTube cooking show. Another wrote a screenplay. An underboss in Jersey was arrested with a cell phone full of selfies and GPS-tracked locations. Russell would have wept, or maybe just shook his head slowly and walked away. Back in Pittston, where his legacy was thickest, the tailor shop was finally torn down. It had stood vacant for years, shutters drawn like eyelids refusing to open. Developers wanted to put in a parking lot. One old man tried to stop them. He stood in front of the bulldozers, hands shaking, eyes damp. You have no idea who sat in that back room, he told them. They didn't care. Progress. History paved over for a 24-hour gym and a taco chain. That was America now. Fast, loud, forgetful. Russell had known it was coming. That's why he kept everything in his head and let the walls crumble behind him. A man named Sal Marino, once Russell's driver in the 70s, still lived in Scranton, long retired, quiet, just another aging face at the VFW hall. One night, over cards, someone asked him, Was he really that powerful? Bufalino? Sal didn't smile, didn't laugh. He just said, "Powerful?" He decided who got to live and who disappeared without a sound. He saved wars and he buried men who didn't even know they were at war. The table went quiet. Sal added, and he did it without raising his voice once. In law schools now, students study RICO through the lens of the Bufalino case. Professors point to the silent strategy of men like him and how hard it is to convict someone who leaves no evidence, only echoes. One federal prosecutor described it this way in an interview. Russell Bufalino wasn't a criminal in the way we understood criminals. He was a philosopher of crime. His only real weapon was patience. And in this country, that's more dangerous than a gun. And yet, in all that noise, all the analysis and the documentaries and the think pieces, one truth remained buried. Not one of the men who truly knew Russell ever betrayed him. Not one turned state's witness. Not one wrote a tell-all with his name on every page. Because in the shadows where Russell ruled, there were still a few old believers. And they still whispered his name with reverence. They didn't need the world to remember. They remembered. The Mafia didn't die with Russell Bufalino, but something inside it did. The dignity, the structure, the unspoken rule that silence is the only language that guarantees respect. Now, the organization was a shell. Deals made over texts, murders caught on street cameras, cases built from social media, not surveillance vans. The old world was gone. And in its place, a louder, dumber, and far more fragile one. But Russell, wherever he was, had already made peace with that. Because he never tried to hold on forever. He simply held the roof up long enough for the rest to get through the storm. And when it was time, he stepped aside. Without a sound. He found the envelope in a shoebox in the back of an attic no one had entered in years. It was a gray morning in Kingston, Pennsylvania, and Michael Bufalino, 34 years old, 2 years divorced, and just recently unemployed, was helping his cousin clean out the last of Aunt Carrie's house. She had passed quietly in a nursing home, just 2 months after her 95th birthday. Her body had held on longer than her memory. The house smelled like old fabric and old secrets. Michael had been there as a kid once or twice when family holidays still meant something. But no one ever stayed long. There was something sacred about the place. Something his father never spoke about except in whispers when he thought Michael wasn't listening. And now, there he was, standing in that attic, dust sticking to his arms, staring at a shoebox labeled only with 2 letters. R.B. He knew the initials. He knew the stories. Every family had them, the shadow in the bloodline, the old man, the boss, the one who never got caught. But that was just family folklore, right? The story they used to explain why Christmas presents always came in cash and why no one ever mentioned what Grandpa actually did for a living. Still, Michael opened the box. Inside were a few black and white photographs. Men in suits, some smoking, some smiling, one that made his stomach twist, a photo of Jimmy Hoffa standing with 3 other men. One of them was unmistakably Russell Bufalino. Next to that, a letter. Folded. Yellowed at the edges. It wasn't signed, it wasn't dated. But the handwriting was steady, clean, every line written in ink, deliberate, like the person had taken their time. Michael read it slowly, then read it again. And when he finished, he sat down on the attic floor like the weight of the letter had pulled gravity tighter around him. It wasn't a confession. Russell Bufalino would never leave a confession. But it was close. It was a letter to nobody, and yet to everyone who came after. A message buried not in code, but in tone. There will come a day, it read, when the world forgets men like me. They'll remember the loud ones, the ones with headlines and mugshots, but not the ones who made the decisions that kept those men alive or made them disappear. Let them forget. I didn't do this to be remembered. I did it to make sure things stayed in balance, that the rules were followed, that the streets didn't run red unless they had to. And when they ask, what kind of man was he? The answer is simple. I was the man who knew what had to be done and did it without leaving a trail. Michael couldn't breathe for a moment after reading that. It wasn't just the words, it was the absence around them, the way they confirmed everything his father never said. That night, Michael sat in his apartment with the letter spread out on his kitchen table, the old photographs beside it like ghosts from another life. He poured a drink, then another, and then he started searching. Not in the conspiracy sites or the YouTube rabbit holes. He didn't want noise. He wanted facts, court records, property deeds, obituaries. What he found wasn't just a rabbit hole. It was a labyrinth. Russell Bufalino had left no official fingerprint, no diaries, no interviews, barely any photos. But every once in a while, Michael found traces, articles mentioning him as alleged associate, reputed figure, quiet Don. It was always the same, quiet, elusive, unreachable. Yet somehow, every decision went through him. Michael learned about Cuba, about the pensions, about the Hoffa disappearance, the theories, the books, the men who broke under pressure and dropped Russell's name like a final confession. And still, there was nothing solid. The man had built a castle out of shadows and silence. Michael's father had died in 2002, cancer. He had been a mechanic, drank too much, and never once talked about his father. When Michael had asked as a kid why Grandpa never came to Thanksgiving, his mother had said, "He's not that kind of grandfather." Now, it all made sense. It explained the way his dad kept the blinds closed at night, the way he burned every letter he got in the mail, even if it was junk, the way he once, in a rare burst of drunken honesty, told Michael, "Some names are too heavy to carry, so you just stop saying them." Over the next few weeks, Michael began tracing the web. He drove to Scranton, then Pittston, sat outside the lot where the old tailor shop used to be. Nothing but a Walgreens now. Nobody there knew the name. He visited the cemetery, found the stone. Russell Bufalino, 1903-1994. No flowers, no flag, just dust. He sat there for an hour, the wind biting through his coat, reading the letter again like it held a key he hadn't found yet. And then he asked out loud, "Why leave this for me?" He didn't expect an answer, but somewhere deep in his blood, in the marrow he'd inherited without asking, he felt a kind of understanding rise up. Russell hadn't left the letter to be remembered. He left it to warn. Michael didn't show the letter to anyone. He thought about it, thought about posting it online, going to a journalist, writing an article, a book, something. But every time he sat down to type, his fingers froze. It wasn't fear. It was something older, something sacred. Russell had lived a life without noise. Why should his truth become someone else's headline? Instead, Michael put the letter back in its envelope, slipped it into a drawer, and left it there. Not because he was ashamed, but because he finally understood what power really was. Not control, not attention, not fear, but choice. And Russell had chosen silence. Now Michael did too. And so the story goes quiet again. The world moves on. The streets are louder now, dirtier, less sacred. But in the back corners of old restaurants and in the dusty records of cases never solved, his name still lingers. And if you listen close, late at night, when the wind moves just right and the world forgets to be loud, you can almost hear it again. The voice that never shouted. The man who never confessed. The name they could never pin down. Russell Bufalino. The one who knew everything and said nothing. Michael hadn't meant to go any deeper. When he found the letter in the attic, it had felt like a one-time thing, an artifact, a curiosity, the kind of secret that settles your nerves just by being explained. But that was the problem with truth. It didn't soothe, it spread, like ink in water. And now it was in him. He started driving more. Small towns, old roads, places where the names on the mailboxes hadn't changed in 50 years. He looked for signs, for whispers. Not of his grandfather. Russell Bufalino wasn't the kind of man you found by asking around, but for the effect he'd left behind. And it didn't take long to feel it. In Luzerne County, he stopped at a diner, the kind of place where the napkin holders still had rust on them and the sugar came in glass jars with metal lids. The waitress was older, late 60s maybe, and when she saw his last name on the card he used to pay, Her hand froze. "You're not—" He nodded slowly. "Grandson." She didn't speak for a long time. Then she said, almost in a whisper, "He used to sit right there. Corner booth, always alone. Always tipped in cash." Michael looked at the booth. It was empty. She added, "Nobody ever sat there after he died. Not even once." Michael didn't say anything, but something in his chest moved, shifted. He wasn't chasing a man. He was chasing a presence. Back home, the dreams started. Not nightmares, not visions, just shadows. He would dream of sitting across from someone, but the face was never clear. He'd speak, but no sound came out, and the man would nod or tilt his head or tap the table 3 times. Then Michael would wake up, heart racing, mouth dry, silence all around him. He stopped sleeping with the lights off. At night, he began reading more, real things this time. Court records, declassified FBI files, FOIA requests. There wasn't much. The FBI had always suspected Russell was behind Hoffa's disappearance. The 302s, their internal reports, referenced him dozens of times, but never a charge, never a photograph, just questions. And then there was one document he almost missed. From 1977, a wiretap transcript. The location was blacked out. The voices weren't named, but someone had mentioned R.B. and Sheeran in the same breath. The quote read, "If he says no, then it doesn't happen. You understand me? You don't breathe unless he gives the nod." Michael sat with that sentence for a long time. That was the thing about Russell. He never gave an order on record. But you felt it when he said yes, or worse, when he said nothing at all. In early spring, Michael drove to the Federal Correctional Institution at Danbury, the place where Russell had spent part of his sentence in the 1980s. He walked up to the front desk, posed as a researcher, asked for records. The clerk shrugged. "You won't find much." "I don't need much," Michael said, "just proof he was here." She printed something, 1 page, inmate number, arrival and release dates. That was it. But on the back of the printout, someone had written a note, a name and a number. Father L. Santoro, chaplain's assistant, retired. Michael called it that night. The man who answered was gentle, with a rasp in his throat that sounded like he'd once smoked too many but quit just in time. He remembered Russell instantly. "He was the most polite man I ever met behind bars," Father Santoro said. "Never raised his voice, never asked for anything." "Did he talk?" The priest chuckled. "He listened. That was his way. I'd come in with the Bible, talk about faith, redemption. He'd nod. Maybe say, 'You're a good man, Father.' That's all." "But did he ever confess?" The line went quiet. Then, carefully, "Not in the way you're asking." Michael waited. The priest sighed. "He once told me, 'If I started naming the men I kept alive just by staying quiet, you'd run out of ink.'" Michael wrote that down. It didn't prove anything, but it explained everything. A few nights later, Michael got a message request on Facebook. The profile picture was a blurry black and white photo of a cigarette in an ashtray. The name was Giovanni Moretti. The message was 1 line. "I heard you're asking about your grandfather." Michael stared at it for almost 5 minutes before responding. "Who are you?" The reply came 2 minutes later. "Someone who owed him everything, and someone who still keeps his rules." They met at a bar near Scranton. Michael arrived first. It was dim, old, and smelled like lemon cleaner and old sweat. Giovanni walked in wearing a coat that looked expensive but worn with age. His face was lined, but his eyes were sharp. He didn't shake Michael's hand, just sat, ordered coffee. "You look like him," Giovanni said. Michael didn't know how to respond. "I worked under him," Giovanni said. "'70s through the 80s. I was nobody, but he made you feel like you mattered if you stayed loyal, if you kept quiet." Michael asked the question that had been burning in his chest for months. Did he really kill Hoffa? Giovanni didn't blink. He didn't need to. Michael frowned. Giovanni continued. He didn't swing the hammer. He never had to. But if he hadn't said yes, then it wouldn't have happened. They drank in silence for a few minutes. Then Giovanni leaned forward. "You want advice?" Michael nodded. "Don't go looking for his sins. You won't find them in books. You won't find them in stories. You'll find them in what didn't happen." Michael didn't understand. So Giovanni explained. "Ask yourself this: how many wars didn't start because of him? How many vendettas were swallowed? How many men stayed breathing because he nodded instead of speaking?" That night, Michael went home and tore up the letter. Not to destroy it, just to make sure no one else would ever read it. He didn't go back to the attic again. He stopped searching the records. He stopped asking questions, not because he feared the answers, but because he finally understood the answers were already part of him. His blood, his silence, his restraint. A month later, he stood at the cemetery again. The wind was soft that day. The clouds drifting slow like ships in no rush to reach shore. Michael looked at the name on the stone, then said out loud, "I get it now. You didn't need the world to know. You just needed one of us to understand." And with that, he turned and walked away. Not as a man chasing ghosts, but as a man who finally understood what it meant to carry the quiet. The past has a strange way of crawling back into the present when you try too hard to bury it. Michael Bufalino had stopped asking questions. He no longer chased ghosts through old streets or dug through dusty files trying to reconstruct what couldn't be resurrected. He had honored the silence. He had walked away from the letter, from the booth at the diner, from the last traces of the man everyone whispered about but never really saw. But the past, it wasn't finished with him. It started with a knock, a Wednesday, early evening. He was making pasta, the smell of garlic and crushed tomatoes curling through his small apartment. When he opened the door, a man in a suit was standing there. Mid-40s, clean shave, crisp tie. But something off in the eyes, too polite. Like someone trying to sell you something, but the thing they're selling isn't in the briefcase. It's you. "Michael Bufalino?" Michael nodded. The man flashed a badge. FBI. The name wasn't familiar. Agent Nichols. "We'd like to speak with you, just a few questions, about your grandfather." Michael didn't move. The pasta water behind him began to hiss on the stove. "I don't know anything," he said. Nichols smiled. "That's what makes you interesting." They met at a coffee shop the next day. Public, neutral. Michael wore sunglasses. Not because he needed to, but because it made him feel like there was a barrier between them. Agent Nichols was calm, but he wasn't casual. He laid it out on the table. "We know you found something. We're not interested in prosecution. Russell's gone. His generation's gone. But history isn't. We want the truth, before it disappears." Michael sipped his coffee. Bitter. Too strong. He liked it that way now. "I don't have anything." Nichols leaned forward. "You know, your grandfather's name still shows up in active investigations. You ever think about that?" Michael looked at him. "Why would a dead man show up in active files?" Nichols didn't blink. "Because the networks he built never died. Because silence doesn't kill operations. It preserves them." Michael smiled just a little. "Then maybe you should be asking someone else." But that wasn't the end. 3 days later, someone broke into his apartment. They didn't take anything. Not his laptop, not his watch, not even the cash in the top drawer. Just his notebook, the one he'd used to scribble his thoughts after reading the letter. It wasn't just gone. The drawer was left slightly open, like an invitation. Michael sat on the edge of his bed for an hour after discovering it, hands shaking, thoughts loud. This wasn't about curiosity anymore. This was about pressure. And pressure was how men broke. He drove to Scranton the next day, took the long route, watched the landscape change, gas stations, empty fields, rusted factories that still stood because no one had the heart to demolish them. He parked near the old cemetery. It was cloudy again. Same gray tone that had followed him ever since that letter. He stood by the grave for a long time, unsure of what to say. Not praying, just thinking. "They want it," he whispered. "The truth, the story. They think it's valuable." And for a moment, he imagined what Russell might have done. Would he have stayed quiet? Would he have made a call? Or would he have stared a little longer and then decided, some stories are only powerful when untold? That night, Michael received a second message, this time not from Giovanni. It was anonymous, no name, no picture, no introduction, just a sentence. Be careful who you let talk you into betrayal. The commission may be dead, but not everyone buried their knives. His blood went cold, because now it was real. There were still people out there, watching, listening, waiting. People who didn't want a book written, people who still kept the old rules, people who remembered Russell Bufalino not as a ghost, but as a father, a teacher, a shield, and those people, they knew Michael was holding a match over the house their lives were built in. The next morning, Agent Nichols called again. Michael didn't answer. He drove instead. Back to Pittston, to the old neighborhood where Russell had lived, to a nursing home tucked between a church and a liquor store. Inside, he asked for Francesco Bellomo, 92, blind in one eye, once a union boss in the 1950s. Michael had found his name in one of the files, a friend of Russell, a quiet figure who disappeared from public life around 1980. They brought him out in a wheelchair, thin as a whisper, but his eyes still sharp. Michael introduced himself. The old man smiled. You're him. Michael nodded. I used to play cards with your grandfather, Bellomo said. He never bluffed. They sat together, talked. The old man told stories, coded, careful, no names, just phrases. Your grandfather didn't believe in noise. He believed in weight and doing things that lasted. Michael asked, why is everyone so afraid of the past? Bellomo's smile faded. Because the past still breathes, boy. It just does it through different mouths now. When he left, he knew. He wasn't meant to write the story. He was meant to hold it, to carry the silence forward like a second spine, not to bury it, not to expose it, but to honor it. A week later, Agent Nichols showed up at his door again. This time, Michael let him in. He offered him tea, sat across from him, calm, still. You said you want the truth, Michael said. Nichols nodded. Michael leaned in. Here it is. You'll never get it. Nichols frowned. Why not? Because you're asking questions with a tape recorder. Nichols narrowed his eyes. And what would you suggest? Michael stood, walked to the window, then said, turn it off. Burn your files. Forget the case numbers. And maybe someone will tell you what actually happened. Nichols was quiet. Then he asked, is that what Russell told you to do? Michael turned to him, voice low. No, that's what he didn't tell me to do, and that's why it worked. The next day, Michael packed the photographs. He wrapped the letter in black cloth and buried it beneath a tree behind his apartment, not because he was afraid of it, but because he knew if it ever saw the light again, someone would die trying to control it. Truth, in the wrong hands, wasn't justice. It was ammunition. And the old world, even if it was dying, still had plenty of shooters left. Russell Bufalino had once said, power doesn't need to survive. It just needs to last long enough for the right person to remember. Now Michael remembered. And that was enough. Michael Bufalino hadn't spoken to Agent Nichols in nearly a month. After that last conversation, the one where he'd drawn the line, made it clear that some truths don't belong on paper. He figured the man would disappear. Quietly. Like most feds do when they realize there's nothing left to squeeze. But he didn't disappear. Not Nichols. In fact, what he did next wasn't quiet at all. It started with a leak, not in the press, no headlines, no exposés. But online, in corners where former agents and law enforcement insiders whispered like ghosts around a campfire. An anonymous post appeared on a deep forum dedicated to unsolved cases. Russell Bufalino's heir has surfaced. Grandson, mid-30s, recovered primary source material. Possibly holds the last known written words from Bufalino himself. FBI made contact. Subject uncooperative. He doesn't know what he's holding. Michael read it 5 times before he let himself blink. There was no name. But it was him. Nichols hadn't just backed off. He'd put out bait for the kind of men who didn't wear suits, but still knew how to turn a secret into leverage. 3 nights later, Michael came home to find his apartment door unlocked. Nothing stolen. Just open. Inside, the room was quiet. Too quiet. The air had that smell. A stale wrongness. Like someone had been standing there too long. The photos of Russell were gone from the drawer. The shoebox from the attic, the one he thought he had stashed in a locked bin, was missing too. All that was left was a business card, placed face down on his desk. No name, just an address in Chicago, and 3 words written on the back. You need protection. He didn't sleep that night. The silence, once comforting, now felt like teeth. Every creak in the building, every car passing outside, every sound in the plumbing, it all listened, like the walls remembered who he was now, who he'd always been. The next day, Michael sat in his car outside a cafe, drinking cold black coffee, staring at nothing. He hadn't spoken to Giovanni Moretti in weeks, but his number was still saved. He called. It rang twice. Then, "This is Giovanni." "It's me," Michael said. "Something's happening." A pause. "You were warned." "I didn't say anything to Nichols. I swear." "I didn't say it was you," Giovanni interrupted. "I said it was happening. And now it is." Michael rubbed his temple. "What do they want?" Giovanni was quiet. Then, what your grandfather kept in silence. "They want to sell. Everyone does now. History is a commodity, kid. Your bloodline is on the open market." Michael whispered, "What do I do?" Another pause. Then Giovanni said something that chilled him. "Now you find out if you're really a Bufalino or just a man with a famous name." Michael didn't go to Chicago right away. He sat with it, let the weight of the words settle into his bones. Because it wasn't just about the past anymore. It was about now. About whether silence still held value in a world that rewarded those who screamed the loudest. And then he made his decision. Not out of pride, but because he knew one thing with absolute certainty. If you don't decide for yourself, someone else will decide for you. Chicago wasn't a city. It was a story written in steel and smoke. Michael hadn't been there since college, but this wasn't a trip for memories. He took a burner phone, left his laptop behind, and used cash the whole way. It felt wrong, paranoid, but somewhere in the back of his mind, he imagined Russell nodding in approval. He found the address easily, a small private building near the edge of Cicero. Brick, old, no signs. He knocked once, then again. Finally, the door opened. A man in his 60s, bald, wore glasses like a professor, but with hands that had clearly broken fingers before. "You're Michael," the man said. He didn't ask. He knew. Michael nodded. The man gestured him inside. The room was small, dimly lit. A desk, 2 chairs, and a single file box placed in the center like an altar. "This," the man said, "is what your grandfather gave us." Michael didn't speak. "You've seen the letter, that was the beginning. But this," he tapped the box, "this is the part no one knows about." Michael stepped forward. Inside the box, photos, receipts, wire transfer slips from the 1950s, property titles tied to fake names, old union documents, and in the center, a ledger, handwritten, Russell's handwriting. Michael recognized it instantly. The old man smiled. "This is the record of every debt your grandfather was owed, every favor, every silent war he ended." Michael looked at him. "Why give this to me?" "Because you're all that's left." Michael stared down at the box. He said, "I thought the commission was dead." The old man smiled. "No, it just went quiet, like it always does." They offered him something then, not directly, but clearly. A seat. Not on the commission. That word had lost meaning decades ago, but something like it. An heir to silence, a steward, not a king, not a boss, but a keeper, of memory, of loyalty, of leverage, the kind of man others still called when things needed to disappear quietly or when the noise got too loud. Russell had been that man. And now the world, or what remained of that world, was asking if Michael would be too. He left the next day. Didn't say yes, didn't say no. But he took the box, and that meant something. When he got back to Pennsylvania, he found another letter waiting on his doorstep. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed. "We know what you took. If you speak, we won't ask again." No signature, no threats. Because they didn't need to threaten. They were letting him know. He was being watched. That night, Michael sat in the same corner booth his grandfather used to occupy. The diner was empty. The waitress from before was gone. A new girl served his coffee. She didn't recognize his name. But that was fine. That was good. He sipped the coffee, tasted the bitterness, felt the weight of the box in the trunk of his car, and he realized, for the first time, what power actually felt like. It didn't burn, it didn't scream, it waited. He thought of Russell again, of the silence he carried like armor, and now it was his. Not because he asked for it, but because someone had to carry it. He didn't call them. He didn't send a message, leave a note, or answer the burner phone he'd tucked into the glove compartment. But a week after returning from Chicago with the box in his trunk, the calls stopped. Agent Nichols didn't show up again. No more knocks on his door. No more anonymous messages. That was the first sign. The second was quieter. The barista at the cafe he visited every morning started giving him the coffee for free. Said the owner told her he was family. Michael didn't even know the owner's name. The third was stranger. His landlord stopped cashing rent checks. Power, real power, doesn't announce itself. It doesn't buy you new cars or gold watches. It doesn't demand to be seen. It's invisible, like the undertow beneath calm waters. Michael didn't feel powerful. He didn't walk taller or talk slower. But the world around him had shifted. And it wasn't because he had money. He didn't. It was because of what he knew now. And even more than that, it was because of who he had chosen to become. He kept the box under the floorboards of his apartment, beneath a piece of plywood cut just right, under a stained rug no one would think to move. Every night he sat at the kitchen table, opened the ledger, and read one page. Only one. It wasn't about the transactions, though they were fascinating in their own right. Payouts, off-book loans, silent partnerships in grocery stores, boxing gyms, construction firms. It was about the names. There were hundreds, some circled, some crossed out. But always beside each name, a symbol. Michael couldn't decipher them all, but he learned the language. A check mark meant trust. An X meant cut loose. A triangle meant watched. A circle around a name, debt not yet paid. These weren't criminals or businessmen. They were chess pieces. And Russell? He hadn't just played the board. He built it. The more Michael read, the more the world made sense. He saw the quiet architecture of power, not just in the mafia, but in politics, real estate, unions, public offices. Everyone owed someone. Even now, decades later, many of those names still mattered. Judges, attorneys, sheriffs, investors. Not all were dirty, but all were tied to something Russell had touched. And now Michael had it all in his hands. He began testing the ledger, just small moves. A name in the book, Dominic Fiorello, still working as a county zoning officer, circled, no X, a triangle beside it. Michael looked him up, still alive, still connected. He made a call, not from his number, a payphone outside an old laundromat. He didn't introduce himself. He just said, "We know your name's still circled. That's not a problem, unless you make it one." Then he hung up. The next week, a building permit Michael had applied for months earlier, one that had been buried in red tape, was approved without question. That was when it hit him. He could move things, not with money, not with favors, but with memory. Russell was dead. But the debt wasn't. The more Michael tested the edges of the network, the more it responded. Discreetly, effortlessly. A traffic ticket disappeared. A local reporter who'd asked too many questions about his name stopped calling. A city council meeting he wanted to attend suddenly had a seat open next to the mayor. Every time he wondered how far it would go, it went further. But it also came with eyes. He began to feel it in lobbies, on street corners, inside cafes, people who knew how to look without looking. the silent question hovering over them. Is he the next one, the successor, the grandson of the ghost, the man who holds the last key? Giovanni called again. "You've started," he said. "I'm careful," Michael replied. "That's not what I said. I said you've started, which means now you have to choose something you can't undo." Michael was quiet. Giovanni continued, "You can walk away, burn the book, or you can keep reading. But if you do, know this: once the world realizes the Bufalino name is back in play, it won't stay quiet." "Not like before." Michael nodded. "I know." Weeks passed. He lived in two worlds now. By day, Michael Bufalino, quiet, jobless, rebuilding. By night, the caretaker, the silent name that began appearing in places where whispers mattered more than votes. He still hadn't said yes to the network, but he hadn't said no. And the deeper he walked, the more it began to form around him, like mist taking the shape of a man. Then came the envelope. No return address. Inside, a single photo, a man in his early 40s, business suit, pressed familiar. On the back, "He's asking about Hoffa and you. He's not FBI. No name, no warning. Just a threat wrapped in curiosity." Michael recognized him, not from memory, from research. Vincent Rinaldi, political consultant, ex-CIA, now private security, which was code for fixer, the kind that didn't ask who disappeared the bodies. Michael knew this was it, the next line. The world had noticed. Someone wanted the story, maybe to sell it, maybe to expose it, or maybe to end it. That night, Michael returned to the box. He opened the ledger again. And for the first time, he flipped to the last page. There was no writing, just one name. Bufalino. Underlined once. No check, no X, no symbol at all. Michael stared at it for a long time, then wrote a single mark next to it. A circle, unpaid debt, unfinished business. He called Giovanni. "I need protection," he said. Giovanni responded, "Then you're in, officially. No more watching, no more shadows. This is the part where you either lead or you die trying." Michael didn't pause. "I'll lead." The next move wasn't loud. Michael didn't go looking for Vincent Rinaldi. He sent a message, the old-fashioned way, a letter, typed, hand-delivered by someone who owed the network a favor. Inside, a photo of Vincent's house, his daughter's school, his summer cabin in Vermont. No words, just presence. Vincent backed off within 48 hours. That was the test, and Michael passed it. Now the calls came to him, not the FBI, not the media, but others, men and women in suits, in uniforms, in shadows. Some didn't say what they wanted, they just asked if he'd listen. And he did, because that's what Russell had done. He listened, then decided, then let the silence carry the message. And now, Michael Bufalino, grandson of the man they could never catch, sat at the edge of history, ready to reshape the world through quiet influence. But the past never stays buried for long, and someone, somewhere, was still watching. Still waiting, not for money, not for blood, but for revenge. Because silence may protect you, but someone always wants to break it. The first real warning didn't come in the form of a threat. It came as a name. One that hadn't been spoken in connection to Russell Bufalino in over 4 decades. Leo Greco. Michael saw it on a folded scrap of paper slipped under his car windshield late one night. No note, no context, just the name, scrawled in block letters like someone wanted to make sure it wasn't misread. The name meant nothing to most people. But Michael wasn't most people anymore. He knew the history, the faces, the chessboard. And Leo Greco was supposed to be dead. Back in the 1960s, Leo Greco had been a small-time enforcer working out of Buffalo. Loud, brash, dangerous in the way a man with nothing to lose always is. He had a taste for chaos and a tendency to speak when he should have listened. Rumor had it he went too far. Beat a union organizer's son nearly to death over a late payment. The boy had nothing to do with the business. He was just in the wrong car at the wrong time. Russell had stepped in personally. Not out of sympathy, out of order. Lines were crossed, and Russell didn't tolerate mess. Greco was dealt with, or so everyone believed. But now the name had resurfaced. Michael drove straight to the box, pulled out the ledger. Leo Greco's name was there, second page near the bottom. Next to it, the mark Russell rarely used, a red line, a symbol Michael had only seen twice before. It meant irreversible, but if Greco was still alive, it meant one of two things. Either Russell had spared him, or someone else had brought him back. Michael didn't panic. He studied. He looked up Greco's name through databases, prison records, aliases, social media ghost trails. Nothing. He didn't exist. And that was the scariest thing of all. Because to disappear entirely in a digital age, to leave zero trace, meant one thing. He'd learned from the old world. And he was using its tools now. Giovanni Moretti met him at a church basement in Philadelphia. They didn't hug, no smiles, just nods. Giovanni lit a cigarette, despite the no-smoking sign. Michael placed the scrap of paper on the table. Giovanni read the name and exhaled smoke like a man trying to get something out of his chest. Leo's alive? Michael nodded. Giovanni stared at the wall for a long time. I thought he was gone. We all did. I need to know why he's back, Michael said. You already know, Giovanni replied. Michael stayed quiet. So Giovanni continued. Leo was wild, uncontrollable. He hated Russell, hated that he couldn't scare him, that his violence didn't impress him. He thought Russell was weak because he didn't swing a bat himself. Michael said nothing. Giovanni leaned forward. He's not back for power. He's not trying to take the network. Then what? He wants to burn it down. Michael didn't sleep that night, not because he was afraid, but because he realized something that Russell must have known every single day of his life. The most dangerous man in the room is the one who believes you stole something from him. Greco wasn't just coming back for revenge. He was coming to erase everything Russell had built, every quiet alliance, every unspoken loyalty, every name in the ledger, including Michael's. He started seeing shadows. Not literal ones, but signs. A tail on his car one night, a package left at his door that disappeared when he opened it, an old photo of his father, as a young man, left on a cafe table, folded neatly in half. Michael understood the message. Greco wasn't just threatening him, he was reaching backward, digging into the parts of Michael's life he hadn't armored yet, the parts still vulnerable. Giovanni called again. He's not alone, he said. Leo's built something, off the grid. Ex-cons, disgraced hitters, men we thought were out. He's been waiting, watching. And now that you've stirred the pot— I didn't stir anything, Michael said. You stepped into a seat no one else could fill, Giovanni replied. That's enough to draw fire. Michael didn't disagree. A week passed. Then, 2. The silence returned. But it wasn't Russell's silence, the protective kind. This silence was unnatural, dead air before a strike. And Michael could feel it in his bones. Something was coming. Then the fire happened. It was subtle, almost artful. Not a building, not a car. Michael's storage unit, the one no one knew about. Inside, a backup of the ledger, notes, research, a burner phone, all gone. By the time he arrived, it was already ash and steam. The fire marshal ruled it electrical. Michael didn't argue. He just stared at the smoke and understood the message. This wasn't about threats anymore. It was war. He activated the ledger, not literally. It wasn't a weapon, but it was the only defense he had. He made calls, not many, just enough. To men who remembered the name, to men who still held influence in small corners of forgotten towns. He didn't ask for favors. He just reminded them that the structure Russell built had kept them alive, that if Greco tore it down, the ones who came next wouldn't ask who they were. They'd just start taking. 3 men came to see him in person that week, an old Teamsters union rep, a retired casino boss, a quiet man who once handled payroll for a shipping company that never lost a single truck. All of them said the same thing. If Leo's coming, we're behind you. But there was one more thing they said too. If you want to keep the crown, You're going to have to wear it like your grandfather did." Michael knew what that meant. It meant more than power. It meant choosing violence when silence failed. And finally, Greco showed himself, not in person, in a video, emailed anonymously, low-res, black and white, just his face, older, angrier. Still feral in the eyes, his voice, deeper now, but controlled. He stared into the camera and said, "Russell took everything from me, made me vanish. But ghosts don't forget, and they don't forgive. You think you're carrying his legacy, but you're carrying his sins, and I'm here to bury both." The video ended. Michael stared at the screen for a long time. Then he closed the laptop, opened the ledger, and found Greco's name again. Red line. But now beside it, he drew something else, a black dot, the final symbol. A mark not even Russell had ever used. Michael didn't invent it, he inherited it. The call he made next didn't go through a phone company. It went through a line that hadn't been tapped in 50 years. He said 5 words, only 5, and then hung up. Because this time, Michael wasn't asking for protection. He was calling in a debt. The phone call Michael made wasn't long. 5 words, no names, no threats, just the quiet ignition of a machine long thought dismantled. Within 24 hours, 3 things happened. A man in Las Vegas who once laundered casino cash through a concrete supply firm suddenly booked a flight to Pennsylvania. A retired dock supervisor in Newark sent his nephew to deliver a briefcase to an address no longer listed on any map, and a priest in Buffalo lit a candle at a side altar no one ever touched, the kind used for messages, not prayers. The network wasn't dead. It had simply been waiting. Michael didn't sleep that night. He didn't pace either, didn't flinch when the wind rattled the window, didn't reach for a weapon. He just sat at the kitchen table, the ledger open in front of him, a pen in hand. Not to write new names, but to read the old ones, Russell's names. Because this war wasn't about bullets. It was about memory, about debt, about who still owed and who was willing to pay. In a warehouse outside Wilkes Bar, Michael met them. 5 men, 4 old, 1 young, all of them quiet. They didn't sit at a long table. There was no oath, no dramatics, just folding chairs, a pot of black coffee, and the kind of silence that meant business. Michael brought the ledger. They brought the history. One of the men, Vincent Mancuso, former Teamsters liaison, pointed to Greco's name. He was always a problem. You know what Russell said about him? Michael shook his head. Vincent leaned back. He said, "He doesn't want power. He wants to watch people lose it." That was Greco's disease, and that was what made him dangerous. He couldn't be bribed. He didn't want to own the structure. He wanted to collapse it. They had a plan within an hour, not to kill Greco, not yet. That would have been easy. But easy left blood. Easy made noise. And Michael had finally learned what Russell had always known. It's not about removing the threat. It's about removing his purpose. They started with Greco's money. The briefcase delivered from Newark held documentation, accounts Greco had opened under fake names. Bank transfers traced through Belize, Switzerland, and a cryptocurrency wallet registered in Malaysia. It wasn't hard to trace, because the people who created the system still owned the back door. 2 calls later, 1.2 million vanished into regulatory purgatory. Not stolen, not flagged, just frozen. Then came the connections. One of Greco's men, an ex-hitman turned nightclub owner, found his liquor license revoked. Another got picked up for a 6-year-old gun charge no one had cared about, until now. One by one, Greco's reach began to shrink. Not loudly, not fast, but with precision. Michael didn't celebrate. He knew better. Because Greco didn't need money to kill. He needed rage. And that was one currency he had in endless supply. The retaliation came 3 nights later. Michael's car, parked outside his apartment, was torched. Not exploded, not bombed, torched. It burned clean, down to the bones. No casualties, no message. Just an empty space where motion used to live. He stood there in the morning light, staring at the ashes. Didn't call the police, didn't ask for a report. He just whispered, "Now we're even." Because Russell never struck first. but he always finished clean. Michael made one more call. To a man in Detroit, no name given, no pleasantries exchanged, just coordinates, and an old phrase once used in Havana, "The air's no longer safe." The man understood, and the machine turned again. That weekend, Greco resurfaced, in person. Michael walked into a bar in Scranton, old school, untouched since the 80s, and there he was. Leo Greco, gray-haired now, but the eyes hadn't changed, still wild, still burning. He sat in the corner, drinking bourbon, staring at Michael like he was waiting for applause. Michael didn't flinch, didn't speak first. He just took the seat opposite him. Greco smiled. "I thought you'd look more like him." Michael poured himself a glass of water from the table pitcher. "I don't," Greco leaned forward. "But you act like him, quiet, patient." "I hate that," Michael replied evenly. "You came back from the dead to say that?" Greco's smile vanished. "I came back to remind the world what your grandfather really was." Michael didn't blink. "A man who kept people like you out of power." Greco slammed his glass down. "He ruined me." Michael stayed calm. "No, you did that yourself. He just made sure no one else followed you." Greco leaned in. "And now I'm going to bury his name, one piece at a time, until no one fears it anymore." Michael reached into his coat, pulled out a small envelope, placed it on the table. Greco stared at it. "What's that? A threat?" Michael stood. "No, a list. 10 men still alive who remember what you did. One phone call and you're erased again. But this time, there's no coming back." Greco didn't touch the envelope. Michael leaned close. "Your revenge ends here, or so do you." And then he walked out. The next morning, the envelope was returned to his mailbox, still sealed. Inside, the list untouched, but on the back, a note scrawled in red ink, "Not over, never over." Michael didn't smile. He didn't worry. He just understood. Because now the war had changed. This wasn't about Greco anymore. It was about the idea of Greco, the chaos, the fire, the men who would always try to bring it all down. And Russell's legacy? It wasn't silence. It was containment. Michael wasn't just protecting a name. He was protecting the code, the old world, the one built on balance, fear, loyalty, and yes, power, but not chaos, never chaos. Later that week, Giovanni met him again. This time, no cigarettes, just coffee. "You did it," he said. Michael shook his head. "No, I started it." Giovanni raised an eyebrow. "And now?" Michael looked out the window, watched 2 men in suits argue over parking, watched a woman feed pigeons on a bench, watched life carry on like silence still meant something. Then he said, "Now I make sure it stays quiet." The nights were colder now. Even in spring, the Pennsylvania air carried a chill that lingered after dark. Not the kind that bit your skin, but the kind that settled in your chest and made you feel like you were being watched, even when no one was around. Michael Bufalino stood at the edge of a small lake outside of Pittston, the same place where Russell used to bring men for conversations that didn't belong in rooms, where the water swallowed words, where silence was sacred. He had the ledger in one hand, a match in the other. And a choice that had haunted him for months: preserve the empire or destroy it. He had told no one he was coming here, not Giovanni, not the quiet men who still answered his calls, not the old names whose debts still pulsed beneath the surface of the cities. This was his alone. Because this was never about building an empire. That had been Russell's job. Russell had held the line. Russell had given men a structure to fear, a boundary not to cross. But Michael had come to understand something deeper. You cannot preserve the old world in a modern one, not without becoming a myth or a monster. And he wasn't sure which he'd already become. Greco had gone underground again. After their final meeting, the man vanished into smoke like the ghost he always was. But Michael knew better. Greco wasn't gone. He was waiting. For a mistake. For a moment when Michael would slip and reveal that the silence was just a mask, not a code. And Michael wasn't going to give him that. He stared at the ledger one last time, The names, the debts, the legacy, his grandfather's legacy. He remembered being 16, watching his father drink alone in the garage, staring at a stack of unopened letters, never speaking Russell's name, never admitting how much fear still lived in the corners of their blood. Michael had thought then that silence was cowardice. He now understood. It was armor, the only kind a man like Russell could afford to wear for 50 years without being taken down. But armor rusts, and ghosts don't die when you bury them. They die when you stop remembering them. Michael lit the match, watched the flame tremble, then dropped it onto the ledger. The fire was slow at first, pages curling, ink bubbling, the names, hundreds of them, vanishing into smoke. He didn't move, he didn't speak, he just watched until the book was ash, and the wind took what was left. By morning, it was like the ledger had never existed. The box was gone, the contacts deleted, the burner phone destroyed, the names allowed to fade into the darkness where they belonged. He returned to Scranton quietly, rented a small office, started a mediation business, dispute resolution, no lawsuits, no courtrooms, just men who didn't want things public, looking for someone who could keep things quiet. Funny how that worked. Russell had solved conflicts with nods and silence. Michael did the same, just with contracts and pens. But the skill was the same. People still feared a man who didn't need to raise his voice. Giovanni called a few weeks later. "You vanished," he said. Michael replied. "I didn't vanish. I let go." There was silence on the line. Then Giovanni said, "That book kept the balance. Now we don't know who's paid up, who's owed, who's waiting to settle scores." Michael looked out the window. Then maybe that balance was never real to begin with. Giovanni didn't argue, but before he hung up, he said, "Russell would have never done it." And Michael answered, "Exactly." The commission, what was left of it, didn't reach out, not directly, but he heard things. How a few of the old guard had finally retired, how a new generation was trying to resurrect the order, louder, faster, sloppier. He didn't stop them, he didn't join them, he just watched. Because he knew what Russell had always known. Power isn't about control. It's about knowing when to walk away and still be feared. A year passed, then two. Michael lived simply. No suits, no guns, no legacy weighing on his shoulders. But once a month, he visited that lake, not to mourn, not to remember, but to listen, to the silence, to the wind that once carried secrets, to the sound of a name that no one dared say out loud anymore. Bufalino. There were rumors, of course. Some said he'd taken over, that he had rebuilt Russell's empire under a new name. Others said he'd been killed, or joined the FBI, or fled to Italy and disappeared into the vineyards. None of it was true. And that's what made it perfect. Because Russell didn't live on through a ledger. He lived on through the fear that he might still be alive. And now Michael carried that too. But with a difference. Russell protected the code. Michael chose to end it, not out of weakness, but because he'd seen what happened when a man forgets that silence should never become a prison. The final time Michael visited the lake, he brought nothing. No books, no thoughts, no plans. He just stood there, let the wind move past him. And then, for the first time in his life, he whispered a prayer. Not to God, to his grandfather, and to every man who'd ever died thinking silence was enough to save them. You did what you had to, but I don't have to become you. Then he walked away. Not a king, not a ghost, not a name. Just a man who had once held the past in his hands, then set it free.